In December of 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved, bringing to an end the communist empire that had ruled almost 300 million people. In hindsight, it's easy for us now to view the collapse of the Soviet Union as inevitable, perhaps even obvious. That couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, almost nobody at the time predicted it. The world was taken completely by surprise. For example, in the words of historian Neil Ferguson,
almost nobody saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming. The number of articles prior to 1989, in the 1980s, that said, this thing's going down, you can count on the fingers of one hand.
Even the most insightful geopolitical thinkers failed to foresee the Soviet Union's imminent downfall. Henry Kissinger is one example. In his own words, none of us, neither Nixon nor I, nor any of the Soviet advisors we consulted, ever spoke of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. George Kennan, another important Western geostrategist, said, "It's hard to think of any event more strange or inexplicable than the sudden and total disintegration of the great power known as the Soviet Union." So, if nobody saw it coming, then why did the Soviet Union collapse? Was it inevitable, or could it have survived? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions, but first we need to have an overview of how it happened, the astonishing story of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before that, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, ExpressVPN. I frequently use public Wi-Fi networks. However, connecting to unsecured Wi-Fi can leave you vulnerable to hackers and data thieves. That's why I use ExpressVPN, a VPN service with top-tier encryption. With ExpressVPN, I can keep my information secure whenever I connect to public Wi-Fi. Another benefit is that it helps you unlock more content on platforms like Netflix. Streaming services often have shows and movies unavailable in your country. Thankfully, ExpressVPN provides a solution. By changing your location to another country, you can access geo-restricted content like The Batman on Netflix. Right now, you can take advantage of ExpressVPN's Black Friday Cyber Monday offer to get the absolute best VPN deal you'll find all year. Use my special link, expressvpn.com/HSH, to get 4 extra months with the 12-month plan or 6 extra months with the 24-month plan, totally free. That's expressvpn.com/HSH to get an extra 4 or even 6 months of ExpressVPN for free. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union was at the height of its power. Its victory over Nazi Germany had given it control of almost all of Eastern Europe, from East Germany to the Balkans. In the aftermath of the war, the world was divided between the capitalist nations led by America and the communist nations led by the Soviet Union. America hated the fact that the Soviet Union controlled all of Eastern Europe, but it was powerless to do anything. In 1949, the Soviet Union performed its first successful nuclear bomb test, making it impossible for America to challenge it militarily. Under the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet state seemed to be growing and recovering quickly from the war. Stalin had managed to keep things stable by ruling with an iron fist. However, in 1953, Stalin died, throwing the Soviet Union into a power struggle. In the end, that power struggle was won by a man who seemingly came out of nowhere, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev seemed like he was going to be a big change, and in 1956 he actually criticized Stalin, condemning his brutality. That speech brought hope to the people of Eastern Europe, who desperately wanted to break free of Moscow's control. In 1956, the people of Hungary rose up against their Soviet-controlled government and demanded an end to communist one-party rule. The uprising was brutally suppressed by Moscow, which sent 30,000 troops and more than 1,000 tanks. That response made it clear to the world that the Eastern Bloc was effectively an empire run by Moscow, and that the countries of Eastern Europe didn't have the option of leaving. Even so, people were desperate to escape communism and enjoy the freedom and prosperity that they saw in the West. For those that wanted to escape, there was actually one route out, through West Berlin. West Berlin was an enclave inside East Germany that was still capitalist and aligned with the West. It was relatively easy for people to go from East Berlin to West Berlin, and from there they could fly to wherever they wanted. Many East Germans did that, and so East Germany lost a lot of its population, particularly its most well-educated citizens. For the East German authorities, that was intolerable and they were determined to stop it. In 1961, without warning, they built a wall around West Berlin, enclosing the people inside it and isolating them from the rest of East Germany. The Berlin Wall made relations between the Soviet Union and the West extremely bad, and they were about to get even worse. The next year, 1961, saw the event that would bring the world the closest it has ever come to ending, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October, American spy planes saw what looked like missile launch sites on the island of Cuba, which immediately raised alarm bells. If those were nuclear missiles, that would mean that the Soviet Union could destroy any city in America at a moment's notice. The Americans began to panic, but they didn't know what to do. Should they invade Cuba, blockade it, bomb the missile sites? Making their decision even more difficult was the fact that they didn't actually know whether the missiles were nuclear or if they were operational. Eventually, the Americans decided to blockade the island and prevent any military shipments from arriving. Any ships that wanted to go to Cuba had to be first searched, and if they had any military equipment, they would be turned away. The situation was extremely tense, and the world came very close to nuclear war. In the end, the Americans and the Soviets were able to come to an agreement where the missiles would be removed from Cuba, and in return the Americans would remove missiles that they'd stationed in Turkey. The agreement had avoided nuclear war, but in Moscow the Soviet higher-ups weren't happy about it. They were angry about the deal that Khrushchev had made because the removal of their missiles from Cuba was going to be public, but the removal of the American missiles from Turkey was going to be in secret. In their mind, the Soviet Union had lost face. In the end, they forced Khrushchev to step down in 1964, and he was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev had been an important general during World War II and was one of the most conservative members of the Soviet leadership. He would face his first major challenge 4 years later, in 1968, when there was another uprising from an East European nation, Czechoslovakia. There, a new leader had just come to power who wanted to give people more political rights and make the economy more capitalistic. As you can imagine, the Soviet authorities were not going to allow that. In August, they sent 250,000 men to stop the reforms and put in place a new puppet leader. The Czech people tried to resist, but they were crushed by the overwhelming military force. The USA and the West were, of course, outraged by the brutality, but they didn't do anything about it. In fact, over the next few years, the Americans began to pursue a totally new policy towards the Soviet Union, what was known as détente. Détente essentially meant engaging more with Moscow, increasing communication and accepting more of the Soviet Union's claims. That led to talks between the two superpowers, which resulted in agreements regarding arms control and human rights. The next major event for the Soviet Union was its war with Afghanistan, which started in 1979. Afghanistan shared a long border with the Soviet Union and had been politically unstable since 1973, when the king had been overthrown in a coup. The new government attempted to push for modernizing reforms, but quickly became authoritarian and lost popular support. Eventually, communists backed by Moscow overthrew the government and executed the president. However, the new government quickly descended into chaos as the communists began fighting with each other. The Soviet leaders in Moscow became concerned that instability in Afghanistan could bleed out into the wider region, affecting its territories in Central Asia. In December of 1979, the Soviets decided to intervene, sending in special forces to assassinate the Afghan head of state and install a puppet leader. However, that backfired and the situation escalated into a full-scale civil war that would require hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. The Soviet Union found itself fighting to support its puppet government against Islamic resistance fighters who were backed by the United States. While the war was going on, important internal developments happened in the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev died, and it wasn't clear who should replace him. The Soviet Union then had two leaders, both of whom were very old and died soon after taking office. Finally, in 1985, power was taken by Mikhail Gorbachev, an energetic leader who wanted to dramatically change Soviet politics. Many of Gorbachev's intentions were well-founded. The Soviet economy had been stagnating and everyday life was getting worse, and so Gorbachev embarked on a massive program of reforms. There were economic reforms that allowed for some degree of free markets and capitalism. The goal wasn't to end the planned economy, but rather to make socialism work more efficiently to better meet the needs of Soviet citizens. There were also political changes, with elections being permitted and more autonomy granted to the various member states. There was also a reduction in censorship, with some independent media being permitted. However, despite Gorbachev's efforts to modernize, the Soviet Union continued to have enormous problems. The war in Afghanistan was going extremely badly, costing them a huge number of men and an awful lot of money. Then, in 1986, there was another huge disaster, the meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Chernobyl was a public relations disaster for the Communist Party. Initially, they tried to cover it up and didn't release a statement for several days. Even when they did, a lot of information was withheld for a very long time. Most unforgivably, the Soviet authorities were slow to evacuate people from the area, putting them in danger. As you can imagine, the public was outraged and the Soviet government looked extremely bad. Over the next few years, the problems began to pile up for the Soviet authorities. The war in Afghanistan continued to go badly, and eventually in 1988 they had to pull their forces out. They had had over 500,000 personnel in the country and still been unable to keep their puppet government in office. It was that year, 1988, that there were the first signs that the Soviet Union might be about to collapse. To understand the fall of the Soviet Union, it's important to understand the difference between the Union itself and its East European puppet states called the Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc included countries like Poland, Hungary and East Germany that were on paper independent. In truth, that was a fiction, and those nations were ruled by governments that were controlled by Moscow. However, those countries weren't officially part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a single country that was made up of individual member states. Its structure was actually somewhat similar to America, with multiple states united to make one overall nation. The Union was made up of 15 member states that included the Baltics, such as Estonia and Latvia, the Caucasus, such as Georgia and Armenia, Central Asia, such as Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, and a few others, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and of course, Russia itself. In theory, the member states were equal partners in the Union, but in practice it was always dominated by Russia and Moscow. That enormous structure began to collapse in February of 1988 when a civil war started in the Caucasus. Two Soviet member states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, went to war over the contested region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Moscow did try to intervene, but failed to stop the fighting, showing itself to be impotent. That was a hugely important moment. The populations of the Eastern Bloc saw how Moscow was powerless to control its member states, and they saw an opportunity to break free. In April of 1988, a huge wave of protests, strikes and riots broke out in Poland. The Polish communist regime was shaken by the unrest and decided to enter into talks with the group that were behind the strikes, a trade union called Solidarity. Solidarity demanded the end to one-party rule and the start of free elections. Things also began to get out of control in the Soviet Union itself, specifically in the Baltics. In November, Estonia declared sovereignty. Now, that wasn't a declaration of independence, but it was the first step towards it. It essentially meant that Estonian laws were now superior to the laws of the Soviet Union. Almost every member state of the Union would go through that step, where they first declared sovereignty and then independence. By the end of 1988, there were the first signs of what was to come, but it was in 1989 that the dam really began to break. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union managed to get an agreement where one-party rule was abandoned and a democratically elected Senate was created. 2 months later, there was a parliamentary election and Solidarity won 59% of the vote. That was a strong message to the world that Poland rejected communist rule. The Baltics also continued on their path towards independence, with Lithuania and Latvia both declaring sovereignty. Then, in August, there was an enormous peaceful demonstration called the Baltic Way, in which 2 million people linked hands and formed a human chain. The chain spanned approximately 700 kilometers and linked to the capitals of the 3 Baltic states. It was a peaceful but powerful demonstration of their desire to be free. A few months later, Hungary started the process of moving away from communism when it started talks about ending one-party rule. Then, on the 9th of December 1989, there was perhaps the most famous event from the whole process, the fall of the Berlin Wall. That happened because an East German government official mistakenly announced that travel restrictions would be lifted between East and West Berlin. Mass confusion followed, and thousands of East Berliners flooded to the border checkpoints, overwhelming the guards who eventually opened the gates. For the first time in decades, people were able to freely cross between East and West Berlin. Much of Eastern Europe was now openly defying Moscow, and the Soviet authorities weren't doing anything to stop them. In Czechoslovakia, a mass protest at the end of November managed to force the communist leadership to resign and allow democratic elections the next year. In Romania, the communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu was determined to cling on to power, but eventually the military turned on him and he was killed. By the end of 1989, all of the countries of the Eastern Bloc had either got rid of their communist governments or were well on their way to doing so. The Soviet Union itself was also implementing some liberal reforms. Gorbachev introduced a multi-party system, and in March of 1990 he organized the first free presidential election in the Soviet Union's history. He would go on to win the election by a large margin. However, the introduction of a multi-party system meant that his powers were much more limited than they had been before, and he faced much stronger opposition. Some were criticizing his policies for weakening the Soviet Union, while others called for even more radical reforms and the abandonment of communism. By 1990, much of Eastern Europe had broken free from Moscow's control, but the Soviet Union itself was, at least on paper, still in one piece. That changed in March of 1990, when Lithuania became the first Soviet member state to declare independence. Moscow did try to stop that from happening by implementing an economic blockade which badly affected Lithuania's economy. Eventually, after 11 weeks, the two sides agreed to enter into negotiations and the blockade was lifted. That didn't deter other member states from following Lithuania's example. Over the next few months, Estonia and Latvia both declared independence, and numerous other member states declared sovereignty, such as Georgia, Ukraine and Belarus. Most interestingly, Russia itself also declared sovereignty. That was because Russia had a strong nationalist movement that was sick of Russian money getting sent to other parts of the Union. By declaring sovereignty, Russia was effectively sending a signal that it didn't particularly want to be a part of the Union that it was the leader of. That said, there were still people in Russia that wanted the Soviet Union to survive, and that is clear from two events that happened in 1991. In January, Moscow ordered a military occupation in Lithuania to try to prevent it from leaving. Soviet military forces, including paratroopers, tanks and special forces, moved into Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. The goal was to seize key infrastructure and reassert Soviet control. Soviet forces targeted the TV tower, a symbol of the Lithuanian independence movement and an important communications hub. However, unarmed civilians came out onto the streets to resist the Soviet forces. 14 civilians were killed and more than 700 injured in what has come to be known as Bloody Sunday. The deaths caused outrage, and faced with international pressure, the Soviet forces withdrew. Despite that failure, Soviet hardliners again tried to stop the breakup of the Union in August when they attempted to take power in a coup. On August the 19th, while Gorbachev was on vacation, the coup leaders placed him under house arrest and told the public that he was too ill to govern. They then declared a state of emergency and sent soldiers and tanks to take control of Moscow. The leader of the coup then held a press conference where he declared himself acting president alongside other hardliners from the Communist Party. According to him, that was necessary to prevent the country descending into chaos. However, the coup plotters failed to neutralize the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin condemned the coup and called for mass protests against it. Thousands of civilians in Moscow and other cities protested, and many of the troops defected to Yeltsin's side. Within 3 days, the coup had unraveled and its leaders had fled. That failed coup was the last major attempt to keep the Soviet Union alive. Throughout 1991, more member states continued to declare independence and nothing was done to stop them. Finally, in December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev formally signed the dissolution of the Soviet Union into law. The communist empire that had existed for 7 decades was no more. So, that is what happened. The total collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence for all its member states. So why did it happen? Why couldn't the Soviet Union survive? Well, the first thing to mention is just how bad the Soviet economy was when compared with the West. Throughout its entire existence, the people of the Soviet Union had a standard of living far lower than those in the capitalist West. People in the US and Western Europe saw their lives improve dramatically right after the Second World War, while conditions in communist countries remained largely the same. To illustrate that, let's have a look at one of the most important consumer goods of all time, cars. Right after the war, there was an enormous boom in car sales in the West, so much so that by the late 1950s, almost 60% of households had a car. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, only 2 to 3 out of 1,000 did. That trend continued in the next decades. By the 1980s, almost every household in America owned a car, while in the Soviet Union, that percentage never got above 10%. That was because the process for getting a car in the Soviet Union was an absolute nightmare. For example, imagine for a moment that you were a factory worker in Russia and you wanted to get a car. Obviously, the first issue that you would have would be getting the money together, since it would cost almost a year's salary. However, even if you did have the money, you wouldn't then be able to simply buy a car. You would then have to go to your employer or trade union office and submit a written request. You would then need to make your case as to why you needed one. Then you would be assessed on things such as whether you were a productive worker and a good citizen. Were you a true believer in communism? Had you been part of the communist youth? Any black mark against your name might be enough to have your request denied. Let's say that you were a model communist citizen, so you passed the test with flying colours. Now comes the waiting. After months had passed, you would find out that your request was accepted. Surely now you would be able to get your car, right? No. Unfortunately, there was such a shortage of cars that even those that were approved couldn't always get them. The trade unions would decide which workers actually received their cars through a bureaucratic system, and it often came down to luck and connections. Ultimately, the average time for an average Soviet citizen to acquire a car was 7 to 10 years. Obviously, if you were well connected, you would be able to get one much faster and maybe even get better Western cars. For example, Leonid Brezhnev owned several Western cars, including a Rolls-Royce, a Mercedes, and a Cadillac. In the West, the process for getting a car was as simple as going out and buying it. In America, they typically cost about 3 to 4 months' wages. That stark difference in car ownership is reflected in many other areas of life, for example, food. Here is a table showing food consumption in the Soviet Union, UK, and USA in the 1970s. As you can see, the Soviet citizens consumed much more bread and much less meat. That was because food production had stagnated. Things had been going well during the 1950s, with farm output growing about 9% annually. However, in the 1960s, things started to get worse and production actually declined. In 1963, the harvest was 107 million tons, down from 135 million in 1958. That meant that people needed to spend more of their income on food. Even in the 1970s, Soviet households had to spend about 2/5 of their income on food, substantially more than the citizens of the West. Some people claimed that the communist model had all sorts of advantages over capitalism, but in reality they were a fiction. For example, it was often claimed that the Soviet Union never had any unemployment. Although it is true that the Soviet government did in theory provide everyone with a job, many of those jobs were essentially people wasting their time. People were employed to do things that were unnecessary or not useful, meaning that in reality they were unemployed, even though they had to turn up at a place of work. That phenomenon is called hidden unemployment, and tens of millions of people in the Soviet Union fell into that category. Even then, there were people that didn't even have a place of work to turn up at, and they were simply not counted in official statistics. One historian of the Soviet economy estimated that the real rate of unemployment in the major cities was 8%, something that the Soviet government refused to admit. Something else that made life unpleasant for Soviet citizens was that the housing situation was terrible. The Soviet government actually prided itself on the fact that there wasn't homelessness on the streets. That was, for the most part, true, but it ignores the hellish conditions that people were forced to live in. The government-provided apartments were extremely small and poorly constructed. There weren't enough of them, so they were very overcrowded, often with multiple families living in one small apartment. To get on the list for a new apartment, a person needed to have a living space of less than 5 meters squared. Even then, the process was extremely slow and they would likely be waiting for years. Some people didn't actually live in houses. A huge part of the population outside of big cities lived in something like a barracks with no toilet or running water. However, even with the situation being that bad, there was still homelessness. People were euphemistically referred to as without definite residence. They often sought refuge on the top of Moscow's skyscrapers among ventilation pipes and heating ducts. The situation was just as bad when it came to health services. The health system was a priority for the Soviet leaders, and in theory, every citizen had access to medical care. In practice, though, most Soviet hospitals didn't have enough equipment. Gloves and needles had to be reused, while modern equipment like MRI machines were almost non-existent outside of the big cities. As you would imagine, health outcomes were much worse than they were in the West. The typhoid fever rate in 1979 was 30 times what it was in the US, and the measles rate was 20 times. Only 40% of cervical cancer cases in the Soviet Union were known before they were terminal, in contrast with 70% in America. One last thing that I'll mention is the huge restriction that there was on personal freedoms. I'm not just talking about freedom of speech or the right to protest, both of which were of course non-existent. I'm referring to the draconian laws around freedom of movement, which in hindsight seem almost medieval. Soviet citizens were bound to their registered location by an oppressive system of internal passports and required state approval to relocate, even within their own country. Those internal passports were used right up until the end, even in the 1980s. So, we've seen just how bad and frankly evil the Soviet system was, and as you can imagine, it was extremely unpopular. Perhaps the greatest demonstration of how much people disliked living under the Soviet Union is the fact that whenever they got the chance, they left. For a long time, the easiest way to leave the Soviet bloc was through Berlin, because it was the only place where there wasn't a border. From 1951 to 1955, 1.5 million people left by going from East to West Berlin. By comparison, only about 300,000 people made the reverse journey. That was a big problem for the Soviets because often the people leaving were the most talented citizens, artists, scientists and athletes. A good example is the male ballet dancer Rudolf Nureyev, who was one of the best dancers of his generation. He was invited by France to perform in Paris, and the Soviet authorities allowed him to go to showcase their cultural supremacy over the West. The whole time he was there, he was under constant surveillance by Soviet secret agents to try to stop him from escaping. In the end, that was all in vain, as Nureyev managed to escape and stay living in the West until the 1980s. Of course, the majority of people had no way to leave. The border controls were extremely strict and escape was almost impossible. The one route that was possible, through Berlin, was eventually blocked when the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. From then on, anyone trying to escape through Berlin would be shot. It's estimated that about 600 people were shot and killed by East German border guards while trying to escape. Another example of the unpopularity of the system is that there were many uprisings against it. Soviet rule was particularly hard to accept for the people of Eastern Europe, and that is where the uprisings happened. The first large uprising happened in East Germany in 1953, after the East German Communist Party essentially demanded that workers work for less money. The East German leaders ruthlessly crushed the uprising with the assistance of Soviet tanks, and 125 people were killed. Then, 3 years later, there was the uprising in Hungary. That happened because the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave a speech in which he criticized Stalin and promised to liberalize the Soviet Union. The brutal labor camps were to be shut down and there was to be less censorship and surveillance. Students in Hungary saw that as an opportunity to break free from the Soviet iron fist and organized huge protests in Budapest. Their demands quickly found popular support, and in the next few days they declared the formation of a new government that broke relations with the Soviet Union. As the situation was getting totally out of control, Moscow decided to invade the country and restore order, sending 30,000 troops and more than 1,000 tanks to brutally suppress the uprising. The Hungarian Communist Party was restored to power, but the price was high. More than 2,000 Hungarians were killed and 200,000 fled the country. Then there was a third major uprising that happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Again, the Soviet Union used force to suppress the uprising, sending in almost 500,000 troops and 6,000 tanks. Communism was re-established in the country, and tens of thousands fled. So, hopefully by now I've persuaded you that the Soviet Union was rotten, corrupt, and deeply unpopular. For me, those are very important reasons as to why it was always likely to collapse at some point. However, I don't think that that is a very satisfying answer to the question of why it fell when it did. After all, there are many governments all over the world that are incredibly unpopular and deliver a terrible quality of life for their citizens, and yet they persist. One example is Venezuela. It has a government that has driven the country into collapse and is hated by the vast majority of its citizens, and yet it remains in power. The Iranian government is also hated by its people, and yet they are unable to topple it. There are numerous others, for example, North Korea or Cuba. The list is endless. So, if just being unpopular isn't a great answer to the question of why the Soviet Union fell, then what is? To answer that, it would be good to take a closer look at what the actual process of independence looked like in practice. A good example is the story of what happened in Estonia. Starting from 1987, Estonians organized large demonstrations every year demanding independence from Moscow. The first demonstration was in the central square of the capital on August the 23rd. The protest had only about 7,000 people and lasted only one day, but it was still a big moment. In the past, all protests had been crushed, but this time Moscow basically didn't do anything. The next year demonstrations happened again, and this time they were much larger, with 300,000 Estonians protesting throughout the country. Still, Moscow didn't do anything, hoping that giving concessions would appease the protesters. Some hardliners in the Soviet elite did demand a robust response, arguing that there should be a declaration of a state of emergency, but their calls were ignored. With Moscow not doing anything, the protests in Estonia grew and grew. With the people sending a clear message that they wanted independence, all eyes were on the Estonian Supreme Soviet, the highest legislative body in the Republic. Under pressure from the protesters, the Supreme Soviet made the bold move of declaring the Republic's sovereignty in November of 1988. It was the first member state of the Soviet Union to do so. Now, to be clear, declaring sovereignty did not mean declaring independence. What it meant was that within Estonia, local laws would take precedence over laws from Moscow. It was a bold challenge to the Soviet authorities. How would they respond? They needed to do something drastic and decisive, otherwise Estonia was going to leave. In the end, Moscow did very little. It gave a few unpersuasive statements, accusing the protesters of being extremists and anti-Russian. As you can imagine, that had no effect, and Estonia continued on its path to independence. Then, on the 23rd of August 1989, there was the most astonishing demonstration of all, the Baltic Way. That was a human chain of 2 million people that crossed the borders of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. It involved about a quarter of the population of the Baltics and spanned almost 700 kilometers. It was a bold gesture and garnered a huge amount of international attention. In March of 1991, they held a referendum and almost 80% of the population voted in favour of independence. The Republic of Estonia was proclaimed just a few months later. With that, Estonia had broken free from Moscow and won its independence. Now, that is just the story of Estonia, and of course, every country had a slightly different experience of getting independence, but I think the example of Estonia is fairly representative. The thing that I really want to draw your attention to is the fact that Moscow did almost nothing to keep it in the Union. There were no tanks sent, no massacres, no violence. That was true of almost every country. In fact, Moscow only used violence in a few select places. It's easy to forget now, but when you think about it, the fact that Moscow did so little to stop the Soviet Union falling apart is absolutely astonishing. Many of the countries that were getting independence had been controlled by Russia for centuries. Many people thought that they basically were Russia. Estonia is a good example. It had been part of the Russian Empire since 1710, almost 3 centuries. For me, the fact that Moscow let it get independence without firing a single shot is extremely surprising. Another example is Ukraine. The majority of Ukraine had been part of the Russian Empire since the late 1600s. Crimea had been won in 1783. Again, for many people in Russia, Ukraine was a part of Russia. And yet, when Ukraine declared independence, Moscow did nothing to stop it becoming a separate state. I think if you asked a historian in the 1980s what Moscow would do if Ukraine tried to declare independence, they would almost certainly have predicted that Moscow would send in the tanks. I think he probably would have found the idea that Moscow wouldn't do anything extremely implausible. So, the question then is why? Why did Moscow react like that? Why weren't they willing to use force to keep their empire together? Well, for me, it's very hard to decide whether it was more a case of the Soviet leaders not being able to do what was necessary or not being willing. First, let's have a look at the reasons why they weren't able to. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was in a state of profound crisis. Its economy was worse than it had been for decades, with long queues and empty supermarket shelves. Even products that had been widely available in 1985, such as sugar and soap, had disappeared from the shelves by 1989. People had to rely on the black market to find basic goods like bread and meat. Those shortages were because the economy as a whole was stagnant. GDP per capita growth had slowed to a mere 1.5%. During the late 1960s, it had been almost double that. All that meant that the Soviet Union was forced to rely more and more on imports from the West, but that just caused an unsustainable trade deficit. That deficit had to be paid for with borrowing, and so debt skyrocketed. In fact, Soviet debt to Western banks rose from 27 billion in 1985 to 39 billion in 1986, more than 40% in just 1 year. Those economic problems were exacerbated by conflicts that were going on at the time. The biggest is, of course, the war in Afghanistan. Over 600,000 Soviet troops had been sent to prop up the Afghan communist government, but after years of fighting, they withdrew with nothing to show for it. Then, in 1988, there was the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. The conflict began when ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh demanded unification with Armenia, sparking violence between the two republics. The Soviet leadership tried to restore order by sending troops, but it was reluctant to use force, and things got out of control. Something else that fed into the crisis was, of course, the meltdown at Chernobyl in 1986. Chernobyl not only exposed the inefficiency of the Soviet state, but it also eroded what little faith the people had left in the government. Aside from that, the disaster also cost a lot of money. The newly appointed Prime Minister called Chernobyl a sudden and devastating blow to our weak economy. Overall, the Soviet Union was in a state of profound crisis, which made it very difficult for the Soviet leaders to do anything to stop countries from leaving. Even if it hadn't been in such a bad state, it still would have been difficult. It's important to remember that the collapse of the Soviet Union was essentially 14 countries all wanting independence at the same time. It would have been pretty overwhelming for even a strong, robust state. So, it's clear that the Soviet leaders were barely in a position to do what was necessary to keep the Union together. But even to the extent that they weren't willing. Essentially, I think it's the case that many of the Soviet leaders basically stopped believing in the whole project. To illustrate that, let's take a closer look at two of the most important men of the story, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Mikhail Gorbachev was elected to be the Soviet leader in 1985 with the hope that he would bring some new ideas to Soviet politics. When he came to power, Gorbachev did believe in the Soviet Union and in communism, but he thought that the way that it had been implemented was totally wrong. He didn't like the Soviet Union's lack of freedom and thought that that wasn't the way that communism should be implemented. He saw the need for radical change in the country and started a vast reform program. One of the main changes was to allow free elections in a multi-party system. Up until that point, there was only one party allowed to exist in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, but now people were going to have non-communist options at the ballot box. It's important to note that Gorbachev wasn't trying to bring down communism. He didn't think that free elections were a threat because he assumed that everyone would vote for the communists. Another big change was that he wanted to reduce censorship and allow for some degree of freedom of speech. Ironically, all of Gorbachev's reforms were actually to make the Union function better and ensure its longevity. He did believe in the project, but he didn't believe that Moscow should force people to be a part of it against their will. His commitment to let countries like Poland do what they wanted superseded his commitment to keeping the Union together. For example, in June of 1989, Poland voted in its first non-communist government. Everyone assumed that that would not be tolerated by Moscow and that they would take drastic action. However, even though he was a communist, Gorbachev was committed to the idea that people should not be forced to live under communism. He said in a speech to the Council of Europe, "The social and political orders of certain European countries have changed in the past and may change again in the future. However, that is exclusively a matter for the peoples themselves to decide. It's their choice. Any interference in internal affairs or any attempts to limit the sovereignty of states is impermissible." That kind of sentiment would have been totally alien to previous Soviet leaders, and it was a surprise to almost everyone. Essentially, Gorbachev was giving permission to Poland to leave the Eastern Bloc. Another good example of a man unwilling to do much to keep the Soviet Union together was Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had been a member of the Communist Party since 1961 and quickly rose up the hierarchy. He was initially a supporter of Gorbachev's reforms, but he actually wanted them to go further and happen faster. Yeltsin essentially didn't believe in communism. He wanted to see a full liberalization of free markets in the Soviet Union. He had fallen out of love so much with the Soviet state that in 1987 he actually resigned from the Communist Party's Politburo. That was an astonishing move. Nobody in history had ever voluntarily resigned from that extremely privileged position. He accused his fellow Soviet leaders of not being truly committed to the liberal reforms of Gorbachev. Yeltsin wasn't committed to the Soviet Union for the quite ironic reason that he actually cared mainly about Russian interests. At the time, there was actually a strain of nationalism in Russian politics. Many Russians were sick of Russia subsidizing the other states of the Soviet Union, and Yeltsin shared that view. Yeltsin actually demanded more sovereignty for Russia from the Soviet Union. With Gorbachev and Yeltsin as its two most powerful leaders, the Soviet Union was essentially led by men that didn't believe in it. Given that, it seems fairly natural that it collapsed. It's important to point out that there were men that felt differently and were much more committed to keeping the Union together. For example, there was a faction in the Soviet parliament called Soyuz that was bitterly opposed to Gorbachev's liberalizing reforms. They demanded the ousting of Gorbachev, the dissolution of parliament, and the outlawing of all political parties. They wanted an immediate declaration of martial law and power to be given to a military committee which would do everything that it could to stop the disintegration of the Union. Soyuz was far from the only group that opposed Gorbachev. In 1991, a group of high-profile public figures wrote a letter titled "A Word to the People," in which they severely criticized Gorbachev and Yeltsin and pleaded to avoid the collapse of the Soviet Union. Perhaps the best example of an attempt to stop the collapse was the attempted coup in August of 1991. That was done by Soviet hardliners who could see what was coming and wanted to stop it. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and sent thousands of troops to Moscow to take control of the city. There were a reasonable number of people in favor of the coup, since it was obvious that under Gorbachev's leadership the Soviet Union would very soon break apart. In the end, though, the coup failed because it simply didn't have enough support. Many of the soldiers that were meant to control Moscow defected, and huge numbers of people came out onto the streets. People in the cities were afraid that if the coup was successful, it would lead to the return of the oppression that they had suffered for so many years. For me, the fact that the coup so totally failed, and the fact that it failed because of a lack of support, shows just how much apathy there was about whether the Soviet Union survived. At that point, everyone could see that it was on the verge of collapse and something drastic was needed if it was going to be averted. The coup presented one last opportunity to hold the Union together, and yet many people in both the population and the elites didn't support it. For me, it's that apathy more than anything else that is the reason that the Soviet Union fell. Whether it could have survived is of course impossible to know, but I think it's plausible that it could have done if the Soviet leaders had been more willing to use force. The unwillingness of the likes of Gorbachev to use violence is actually quite unusual throughout history. Many other leaders at the time were far more determined to hold on to power. A good example is the communist leader of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu. Ceausescu was in power for about 24 years and was incredibly brutal and oppressive. He set up a secret police that was one of the most feared in the world. When there was a rebellion in 1987, he didn't hesitate to use violence against protesters. Another example of a regime much more willing to be ruthless to remain in power is of course the Chinese Communist Party. In June of 1989, it carried out the famous Tiananmen Square massacre. That happened because there had been peaceful demonstrations by students calling for political reforms and greater freedoms. The Chinese Communist Party responded with a brutal crackdown, sending in troops and tanks to suppress the demonstrations and killing thousands. I think, in large part, the Soviet Union fell because its leaders were not willing to act in such a brutal way. In fact, an aide of Gorbachev once said that he lacked the guts to have his Tiananmen. He only had to suppress the first stirrings of separatists and radicals, and the Soviet Union would have remained in good health. This, however, would have meant bidding farewell to his glorious dream of bringing democracy to our country, and would have dealt an irrevocable blow to his personal prestige as a reformer. In conclusion, there are many reasons why the Soviet Union fell. Its economic problems and poor quality of life meant that it was always likely to fall at some point. However, in my view, the fact that it fell when it did probably comes down to the decisions and actions of a small group of men. The fact that the likes of Gorbachev let the Soviet Union fall without resorting to much violence has won him respect amongst many in the West. To others, like Vladimir Putin or the Chinese Communist Party, he's a figure of contempt. One of the best quotes demonstrating that comes from the son of Deng Xiaoping, the former CCP chairman. He once told an American journalist, "My father thinks Gorbachev is an idiot."